Welcome to the Betterment Lectures. My name is Dr. Dorian Miners, and if there is one thing I've learned as a brain scientist, it's that there is no instruction manual for this device in our head. But there are patterns of thought, patterns of feeling, and patterns of action, because that's what brains do. They create the patterns that gracefully handle the predictable shapes of everyday life. So let me teach you about them. One pattern, one podcast, and you see if it works for you. Now, I want to do something a little bit more fun and speculative today, because as I've done more and more of these lectures, I have deferred more and more of the process to AI. And my last lecture was uncomfortable to listen to because you can hear me fighting with the speech notes that AI derived from the article the lecture is based on. Very uncomfortable to listen to. So I'm going to go back to doing what I was doing at the beginning of this, which is just speaking off the article itself. And for that, I thought I'd choose an easy one. You know, there's one idea that's really come to colour an enormous proportion of what I teach as an associate professor of behavioural science here at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, which is the idea that reason, deliberative reasoning, isn't the rational, logical, evidence-driven process we like to think it is, but might actually be more of a lazy process of rationalizing our intuitions to ourselves. Now, I'm not going to talk about that in detail today, but I will link to an excellent book on the subject, The Enigma of Reason by Mercier and Sperber, as well as an article or two of mine where I do talk about it. But as it's colored more and more of my teaching, I started to think about how it might be a reflection of some of the tendencies of the brain that used to puzzle me when I was working as a brain scientist at Cambridge. And I want to illustrate that today with a pretty curious phenomenon, which is how the brain processes the colour purple. Now, I think this might end up being a bit of a controversial take, but at least it'll be fun. So let's talk about how the colour purple doesn't really exist. In primary school, we learn that colour is a property of what light is reflected back at us. So the light comes from the sun, it hits an object, the object absorbs some proportion of the light and reflects back some of it, and that's the colour that we see. So like a leaf absorbs everything in the light spectrum that isn't green, reflects back the greenness from, I think, the chlorophyll. I don't actually know how that works, but I am a brain scientist, not a leaf scientist, so you'll forgive me. And as a consequence, we see a leaf as green because that's what's left of the light spectrum after the leaf has absorbed whatever it absorbs. So now moving away from my ignorance about the interaction between leaves and light and more to my domain of strength, the brain. Now, what's interesting about studying the brain is you learn that colour actually isn't that. It's something more to do with how the brain processes that information. See, colour for humans comes about because we have these cells in the eye that are sensitive to different wavelengths, I guess, of light. And in my article on this, I have a nice illustration, but I'm going to have to figure out how to do this verbally, which I am realizing takes me into scientific territory that I know almost nothing about. I guess the best way to explain it in audio format is light is comprised of a bunch of different photons. We call these wavelengths. Some are moving really fast, some are moving really slow. And you've probably seen images of this. I'll put in the show notes an image, but the kind of radiation that comes from a nuclear bomb is super fast. And the kind of radiation that is picked up by radio antennas is really slow. And in the middle of those two things is the visible spectrum of radiation, which we call light, I guess. And the eyes of humans have 3 photoreceptors that are sensitive to different speeds of photons, or I guess a better way to put that is the rate at which it captures photons. So we've got two things going on here. Light comes and it hits our leaf, and the leaf absorbs some of those photons, but it reflects back the ones in the green spectrum, the ones moving at the speed that we see as green. And the reason we see it as green is because it comes into the eye, and there's a photoreceptor that is perfectly placed to capture photons that are moving at that speed. We have a green photoreceptor, essentially. We have two other kinds of photoreceptors. You have S cones, which are sensitive to shorter waves, or I guess faster waves. And we see those things as blue. And then we have L cones. And L cones are sensitive to slower wavelengths. And we see those as red. And what's interesting about that is, obviously we can see more than just three colors. We don't just see blue, green, and red. We see yellow, right? And we see purple, and we see pink. And the reason that we see those things is because, kind of like mixing colors in paint, the brain realizes that if you're getting a little bit of the M cone, the green photoreceptor, and a little bit of the L cone, the red photoreceptor, then probably you're seeing something that's reflecting light in between the two. And so we see that as orange, a kind of a mix between green and red. So you don't have like a cell in the eye that tells you what things are reflecting yellow light. You have the brain processing a green cell and a red cell and saying, oh, that's probably yellow. And that's the entire visible light spectrum to us. These three cells in the brain, these three photoreceptors, the entire color spectrum is your brain working out what colors it can see based on the activity of these three photoreceptors. But what's really interesting is because the way this whole thing is set up means that sometimes the brain has to invent colors. And purple is an example of this. So let's talk about it. So the shortest wavelengths of light, or the fastest photons that we can see, come through as this sort of violet color. And this is a really good way of illustrating how the brain processes color. Because it's only got these three photoreceptors, and it's got to try and express to us what information it has available. So the information it has is the blue photoreceptor responding sort of weakly to something. So it wants to show us something, but it knows that the green photoreceptor is not firing at all. So it can't be something that is slower than blue. So it shows us this sort of sub-blue color, this violet. Now, as the waves get slower, longer, what we see becomes bluer and bluer because the brain's trying to tell us, hey, look, the blue cell is getting more and more excited. And then eventually the green cell starts to kick in, and the brain wants to tell us that. So we start to see this cyan color. It changes from blue to something else. And as the waves get slower, longer, we see this color change to become more and more green because the brain is trying to tell us, hey, the blue cell is firing less and less, but the green cell is firing more and more. And the process continues. The waves get longer, the photons get slower, but now you've got the red cell kicking in. It starts to get more and more excited. So the brain says, hey, look, the green cell is starting to fire less and less, but the red cell is getting more and more excited. So you're going to see yellow through orange and into red, which eventually becomes this sort of muted color as the red cell fires more and more weakly to the increasing length of the light waves, and then it stops being something that we can perceive. On that side, it goes into infrared or IR, and on the other side of the spectrum, after violet, when we can't see the light because it's too fast for our photoreceptors to pick up, we get UV or ultraviolet light. And that's the interesting point, because we shouldn't see more colors than violet. There is no wavelength of light that corresponds to more purple than violet. because we don't get more colours when we go past violet. We get into ultraviolet, which is a colour that's invisible to us. We don't have a photoreceptor that responds to light that's moving at that speed. So the question is, where do these other kinds of purple come from? And the answer is it's a sort of invention of our brain for something that's confusing to this triadic system of photoreceptors. So what we're seeing when we see other kinds of purples is a kind of invention of the mind. Things that reflect fast and slow light waves are usually green because photons that move at this sort of medium speed are captured by our green photoreceptor. But some things reflect just fast and slow light without reflecting that kind of medium green wavelength. And the brain has to solve a problem here. It knows that there is something between blue and red. It has a solution to that problem already. It has green as a color that it shows you when the light is between blue and red. But in this case, the visual system isn't getting any of those green signals because whatever is reflecting the light to us isn't reflecting green. It's just reflecting faster and slower light waves. So the brain has to do something. It can't show you green because that would be wrong. It's not getting any signals from the green photoreceptors. So what it does is it makes up a brand new color for us to see. It makes up purple. Purple is the brain telling us that this is something that isn't, but it should be green. It's what we call a non-spectral color. It's a color that doesn't exist on the light spectrum. And I really love this illustration, not just because it's kind of fun that the color purple doesn't really exist. I love it because it illustrates that the world that we see reflects our purpose in being in the world, something I write about a lot here, and I'll link to that in the show notes. But we don't care so much about the objective reality of the world, some objective model of the world. What we care about is what matters to us. And at some point, things that reflect super short and long wavelengths of light matter to us. And so our brain has to invent a way of representing that to us. And so a color wheel is this beautiful illustration of that fact. Half of it reflects an objective fact, something about the speed at which light that we're seeing moves. And half of that color wheel is an invention, not reflecting some objective fact about the world, but reflecting a human need, something the brain needs to make up to represent to us. And now I have to figure out how I'm going to take that back to my original point, which was on how lazy human reason is. So let's go into a little outro section to figure that out together. What I'm hoping you're taking away from this is that the brain's job isn't so much to reconstruct some objective fact about the world. It's to help convey to you information. It's to create some representation in your mind of the world that's useful to you, that helps you navigate it. It's not really relevant whether purple exists or not. It's not so important to the brain that purple doesn't follow neatly along with the rest of the visible light spectrum, because the brain's not interested in showing us something objective about the light spectrum. The brain's interested in helping represent to us whatever we needed to know about the light spectrum. And sometimes we needed to know about things that were reflecting both super fast and super slow light. And for whatever reason, sometimes we needed to know about things that reflected both fast and slow light waves, but not medium ones. You can imagine something to do with foraging, for example. There are other non-spectral colors. Pink is one of them. You'll actually notice that if you look at an image of the light spectrum, pink doesn't appear at all, because we only get pink when all three of our color cells are active, but the red photoreceptor is the most active. And so the brain gets sort of confused by this and shows you something that is kind of red, but also obviously not. Now, I tell you that because I think it's kind of fun that the prettiest sunsets are basically a set of imaginary colors. Colors that are an artifact of a way that our body has learned to respond to the world, and our brain has made up in response to that. And I guess that brings me back to the property of human reason. There are a lot of examples in the empirical literature of people creating nonsense reasons to explain phenomena that they can't really articulate because they sit outside of our common experiences. Maybe the most famous examples of this come from split brain patients. Now, split brain patients are, as it sounds like from the name, patients who have had their brains cut in half across what's essentially connective tissue that binds two functional halves of the brain, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Now, this is a drastic step, but it's done to patients who have such bad seizures that cutting the brain in half is preferable. Seizures are essentially an electrical fault that's spread from one part of the brain across the surface. And if you cut the brain in half, it can only spread so far, right? It can't spread to the other half of the brain. What's really interesting about these patients is what happens to their ability to describe what they're seeing. So, and a bit of context that's necessary to understand this is a lot of the architecture responsible for helping you understand and produce speech sit on the left side of the brain. It's one of the reasons why you end up with these myths about creative and logical brains and things like this, is a lot of speech production happens or is related to processing that happens on the left side for most people, not all people. Now, if you show people an image, now I'm going to try and simplify this experiment a little bit for, a podcast, but I'll find a link to some of these interesting findings for you to follow up on them. Let's say you have one of these split brain patients, and understanding that each eye plugs in to a different side of the brain, just like each arm is controlled by a different side of the brain, and so on and so forth. So the famous experiment, the seminal one, researchers flashed two different images to the two eyes of the patient. In the eye connected to the language side of the brain, they showed a chicken claw. And to the other side of the brain, the one that is no longer connected to all that language infrastructure, they showed a snowy scene. And then they asked the patient to use their hands to select associated images that related to those things that they could see. So the language hand, remembering that this side of the brain saw a chicken claw, selected a chicken. And the non-language hand, remembering that this side of the brain saw a snowy scene, selected a snow shovel. Then what they did is they asked the person to explain why they had selected what they selected. And the person said, well, I selected the chicken because I saw a chicken claw. And obviously I selected the shovel so that I could clean the chicken poop out of the chicken shed. They said nothing about the snowy scene. Now again, that's a simplification of the experiment, but I'll try and find a link for it. The point being is that the faculty of reason obviously had no access to what the non-language part of the brain could see. And yet it had to come up with a reason for the behavior of the person. They'd picked a shovel. Why could they have picked a shovel? Well, perhaps because you have to shovel out the chicken coop. And I think that this bears some non-trivial resemblance to the way that the brain makes up color. When it doesn't understand why we've engaged in a certain kind of behavior, It confabulates an explanation. I guess what I'm wondering is the chicken shovel the same kind of thing as a sunset? An explanation made by the brain to represent stuff that it doesn't really understand. And in these cases, they're pretty harmless. But if they're happening in these cases, when are they happening and they're harmful? I think going beyond that, the brain seems to be a storyteller down to the lowest level of perception. And I guess it's something that sort of troubles me. And on that happy note, I guess I'll leave it there.